Hello, I've got a day 4 here with Romans 3:20 through 26. And I really like this passage. So I'm going to jump straight into it here. The question that I asked was, what does this tell about ourselves, God? And I changed it up a little bit for the third part. So what does this tell us about the law? Meaning like the way to salvation. And first, for ourselves, verse 20, we see that we can't be justified by works. There isn't enough good things that we can do to be right with God. And then verse 23, we see all have fallen short, right? Because if we were to be saved by good works, we would have to do every single thing perfect all the time. We couldn't mess up at all, because as soon as you're messed up, you have sin, and you can't erase sin with good works. And we all have fallen short of that standard of perfection. And if we just stop there, that'd be really depressing, saying that we are all imperfect and flawed and tainted with sin. But it doesn't stop there. Verse 24, we see we are justified by grace. That is how we can now receive salvation and be right with God. This also tells us a lot about God. Verse 23, it tells us that God's glory is far surpassing ours, or way larger than our glory. Verse 24 tells us that God's grace is why we are saved. And remember, a few videos ago we talked about how grace was that unmerited or unearned favor. We see in verse 25 that Christ dying on the cross was always part of God's plan for salvation. And verse 26, we see that God is just, and He is the justifier, and He is righteous. Those are just core attributes of who God is. And just knowing who those are, or what those attributes are, really lets us know who God is. And finally, what this tells us about the law. The law was originally from the Old Testament, and that is where God came down and said, hey, I have this list of statutes that you need to follow. These are the good things you need to do, and these are the bad things you need to avoid. And while God gave us that to help us to not mess up, it also showed us how to mess up, right? Because if you don't know to not steal, you just completely are unaware of it, it's harder for you to be, oh, you intentionally messed up. But if you know that stealing is wrong and you still steal, you are condemned by that. And so, the law brings knowledge, and with it you get the sin that comes there. And then verse 21, salvation is now apart from the law, where, as in the Old Testament, you had to follow these right standards. And even then it wasn't perfect. And now we don't have a list of rules that we need to follow. Right now, our salvation is based upon Jesus' work on the cross. And verse 24, we see that, how our new salvation is not merit or works-based, but it is gift-based. It is given to us by God. It isn't what we do, it's what we receive. And then verse 25, I think, is really interesting. How it says that God passed over former sins. And I'm taking this to mean that God doesn't immediately strike us down or punish us when we sin. Because if He did that, we would have almost no hope, right? Because, you're a little kid, and you shouldn't hit your sibling or yell at your parents, but you do it anyway. God would be completely just, going, boom, you have sinned against me, and and I'm just wiping you off the face of the earth. But he doesn't do that. He passes over those sins and allows us time after we sin so that we can have that restored relationship with him. And I really just believe that is his grace and his mercy, not just striking us down where we stand when we sin against him. And so I just think that's a very humbling viewpoint to have, where God is constantly giving us second chances to come back to him, to accept his lordship, and to accept the saving that only Christ gives. And he gives us that time and allows us to mess up over and over and over again. Overall, I really just think this passage shows how far from God we really are, how far we are away from perfection, what we need to do to do it on our own, because we can't. And this really also just shows how great God is and what he has done and in his salvation. I just absolutely love this passage. But I'm curious to what you pulled out of here. I'd love to hear about it, love to know what you got out of this. So.